Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. I'm looking forward to our discussions. I'm sure you must all be exhausted at this end of the year on a Friday. I understand that this is the last class of the day, so I hope we can have a dynamic conversation, and do feel free to reach out at any time so that we can have a more dynamic interaction. So, I'm speaking to you from Brasilia, which is the capital in Brazil. I believe I am 4 hours behind you, the Brazilian time zone. And I'm very thrilled to present to you this paper named New Directions in Latin American Structuralism, a three-gap model of sustainable development, which is co-authored by Gabriel Borsile, José Eduardo Latorre, Martin Cherkassky, myself, and João Romero. The reason that I am excited about discussing this paper is that, as you know, Brazil recently hosted COP30 last year in Belém, and many of the topics that we'll be seeing here today were discussed at this important conference. So, to start, this is the proposed agenda. We will cover a brief introduction, then we will cover the analytical or conceptual grounding, which is the three-gap model. We will discuss what we mean by structural change in each of the three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. Then we will see a few simulation results, policy recommendations, and some final remarks. So that is the agenda for the day. So with regards to our motivation, why have we decided to focus on this specific topic on this paper? ECLAC, or CEPAL in Portuguese and Spanish, has been putting forward a proposal for transformative change in the development paradigm in Latin American and Caribbean countries, named the Big Push for Sustainability. The Big Push for Sustainability is an approach focused on structural change, and it departs from a diagnosis that establishes that the countries in the region have been facing a triple developmental trap: an economic development trap, whereby the average economic growth rate in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 10 to 15 years has already been below the average of the 1980s, which is considered the lost decade in terms of economic growth. Indeed, the region faces the risk of facing a third lost decade in terms of economic growth. This represents a development trap because with limited economic growth, there will be limited space for other policies to take place, namely, or most importantly, fiscal space. The tax revenues that amplifies the fiscal space are very limited in a context of slow economic growth. The second development trap is the social development trap, whereby ECLAC has been emphasizing that although the region has seen important progress at the beginning of the present century, the region still presents the highest disparities in the planet in terms of income distribution. So the social development trap refers to a situation in which the distribution of the benefits of income mainly, but other assets and other benefits of development is highly concentrated. Then the third development gap refers to fragile institutional capabilities. The states in Latin American and Caribbean countries are severely limited in terms of physical space, as already mentioned, but also in terms of human resources, in terms of capabilities, etc., and so on. And so this diagnosis already highlights the urgency for the need for structural change. But one thing that we stress, and we have stressed at COP30, is that the climate emergency will aggravate these very three developmental traps. Climate emergency aggravates the low capacity to grow trap, because extreme weather events such as hurricanes or floodings or long droughts, these are all events that limit even more the capacity to grow. In agriculture, when we think about how fragile crops are in a scenario of droughts. Also in terms when we think about hurricanes or floodings, in terms of the destruction of the productive apparatus of infrastructure, etc. Climate change will also aggravate the social development trap, because the impacts of climate change are not equal. Indeed, the effects of climate change are disproportionate upon those communities and social groups that are already most vulnerable. And climate change will also put further pressure on the state capabilities that are already limited. Extreme weather events will increase the need for fiscal revenues to rebuild economies, will put further pressure on the already limited human resources and governance that will need to be established to address the impacts of climate change. So bear in mind this diagnosis that the region is facing a threefold developmental trap that it is already being aggravated by climate emergency. We have been challenging ourselves with a proposal, which is named the Big Push for Sustainability, that seeks to address all three traps of development at the same time. So we seek to identify what will be the converging elements that would allow to close the economic, social, institutional, and environmental gaps at the same time. So the Big Push for Sustainability is an approach focused on investments, understanding that there is no transformation without investments. So the main object of research of the Big Push for Sustainability is transformative investments, identifying what those investments are, what scale, and how they can be mobilized. And if we had to summarize the idea of the Big Push for Sustainability in one word, this word would be coordination. The coordination of bold policies to redirect technical change towards green technology in favor of employment and income distribution. It's essentially an approach that argues for a restructuring of incentives and disincentives so that these multiple objectives can be met. So the research questions that we pose ourselves are these policies strategic complements or strategic substitutes? And are the efforts directed at enhancing international competitiveness in conflict with those aimed at improving income distribution? Is it possible to implement a policy of full employment that at the same time does not compromise environmental protection? So as you see, we seek to identify the precious converging space that would allow for all of these developmental gaps to be addressed simultaneously. So our hypothesis is that there is a path of structural change in which those trade-offs are minimized and positive reinforcements are encouraged. So the three-gap model is the theoretical grounding of the Big Push for Sustainability. And the model is very simple. It establishes that a development path is considered sustainable if it meets three conditions. And you will see that the three dimensions here, the economic, the social, and environmental dimensions, are explicit in this very simple model. The first one is that the development path shall be economically sustainable. And in a center periphery model, the main constraint to long-term economic growth is external constraint to economic growth. This means that the economy shall grow without imposing further restraints on its external accounts or balance of payment constraint growth rate. And let me develop this a bit further. In a center periphery model, we can understand what it means by making an analogy with ourselves, with individuals. So let's think about when our income increases. When our income increases, we can always buy some more juice, another fruit, another apple. We can always buy a bit more of relatively simple goods. But from a certain level of income, we will not be buying further food or beverage, etc. So there is a limit when the income increases to the increase in the consumption of more simple goods and services. But this is not true for more sophisticated technologies. When our income increases, we will always want a new generation, a more up-to-date iPhone or gadget. When we think about more sophisticated technologies, the elasticity, the income elasticity of demand is almost infinite. We will always be willing to buy more sophisticated goods as the income increase. This is true for individuals, but this is also true at the macroeconomic level, at the country level. So when the income of the global economy increases, the demand for more simple goods increases less than the demand for more sophisticated goods. And what this means in a center periphery model is that peripheral economies that tend to specialize on commodities, on relatively less complex, less technologically sophisticated goods, they will get a less or a smaller piece of the growth in the global income in comparison to center economies that specialize in sophisticated, highly complex goods and services. So this is, in a nutshell, in very simple terms, the center periphery models. When the periphery specializes in commodities, in more simple goods, they will keep growing at a slower rate than the center because of the income elasticity of those goods in comparison to the center that specializes in more sophisticated goods and services. So what this means in the long run is that there is a ceiling. There is a ceiling of growth that peripheral countries can grow. And this is the economic sustainability of the model in a very simplified manner. The second dimension is the inclusive or the social dimension in the model. And this means that the model cannot allow for inequality to grow more. And it's actually desirable that inequality would be reduced and that poverty would decline. As you recall from my remarks at the beginning, Latin America and the Caribbean is the region that faces the largest inequality in terms of income distribution in this planet. There is no other region that faces more social disparities than Latin America and the Caribbean. Hence, in the social dimension, we understand that development path that is socially inclusive is one development path that does not allow for further inequalities, for inequalities to be aggravated, and in effect allows for a reduction in inequalities and a reduction in poverty. And the third condition for sustainability is the protection of the environment, which I will discuss further when we see the details of the model. So as you see, the three dimensions are very explicit in the model: the economic, the social, and environmental, and these can be translated in three rates of economic growth. The economic growth rate is defined as a growth rate that is consistent with external equilibrium. And you can see here on the screen, I don't want to bore you with the technical details of the model, but here you can see the YT, which is the economic growth rate with trade external equilibrium. And this is defined as a coefficient between income elasticity of exports divided by income elasticity of imports. And for the reasons that I mentioned to you earlier, this coefficient will be larger than 1 because of the specialization of peripheral countries in low-tech, less sophisticated goods. And here you can see the YW, which refers to the rate of growth of the rest of the world. So the convergence requires that YT is larger than YW because of the structural characteristics of center and peripheral economies. So the technology gap implies, as I mentioned, that periphery specializes in low-tech sectors, and this pattern of specialization shows low diversification, fragile or low technological capabilities associated with low income elasticity of exports and high income elasticity of imports, which means a divergence. So this is, in essence, the economic dimension in the model. In terms of the social dimension, an economic growth rate is defined YS, that allows for reducing inequality and eradicating poverty. So this would be a minimum rate of growth rate that would allow for the creation of formal employment and the strengthening of the labor movement in wage bargaining. So the largest the employment rate, the more employees can bargain for larger wages, thereby reducing inequalities. And there are also universal social protection mechanisms and the construction of welfare states. You can think here as a social net that would act directly upon those that are not included in the labor markets, but are under poverty and should be protected by social policies from the state. So this rate of growth should create formal employment at a rate sufficiently high so as to absorb situations in a situation of underemployment and informality into higher productivity, better paid jobs. This is the condition of the social growth rate. And when we think about the environmental growth rate, that is the economic growth rate that is compatible with environmental sustainability, the way that we define this environmental growth rate is bearing in mind the carbon budget. The carbon budget, I'm not sure if you are familiar with this concept. The carbon budget is the amount of carbon that can be emitted or thrown into the atmosphere at a level that is compatible with the Paris Agreement goals. So this is the maximum amount of carbon that the atmosphere is capable of absorbing without surpassing the limits that are compatible with the Paris Agreement goals of 2 degrees Celsius warming. So what this means is that the rate of the decarbonization in the center and the rate of the decarbonization in the periphery, they will fight or they will compete for this amount of carbon budget that is available for greenhouse gas emissions before the thresholds are met. And so the gap is defined by the rate of decarbonization in the periphery less the rate of the decarbonization in the center. So X would be the maximum amount, maximum global growth of emissions compatible with the 2 degrees. As mentioned, this is in line with the carbon budget. Alpha is the contribution of the periphery to the total global emissions, and YC is the rate of economic growth in the center. So this equation gives the amount of carbon that is available for the periphery to emit, considering the rate of decarbonization in the center and the amount of emissions globally that is compatible with the carbon budget. So these are the 3 dimensions and the way that these rates are defined in the model. Here we can see this put in a graph, and as I mentioned, this is a very simple model, but it illustrates the arguments and, most importantly, the recommendations that stem from this kind of modeling. So here, Y star, you can see the growth of the center, the external growth, and Y, you can see the growth rate in the periphery. So for a given growth rate in the center, Y bar here, considering the balance of payment constraints, here you can see YT, so this is the economically sustainable growth rate. This would put peripheral countries in this point here, in B, right? Where we have for a given growth rate of the center, the economically sustainable growth rate of the periphery would be YT, okay? However, YT, so the economically sustainable without aggravating external disequilibrium, trade disequilibrium, is slower than the necessary social rate. So the economies in the peripheries should be growing at a faster pace than the balance of payment compatible economic growth rates in order to create jobs, absorb informal workers, and eliminate poverty. So this difference here, A to B, this represents the social gap. However, there is an environmentally compatible or an environmentally sustainable growth rate that is slower, not only in comparison to YS, the socially sustainable economic growth rate, but also it's a slower growth rate in comparison to the economically sustainable growth rate, as mentioned. So the amount of carbon that peripheral countries would have available without surpassing or trespassing carbon budgets would deliver a relatively slower economic growth rate. And this difference here from B to C represents the environmental gap. So here you can see the gaps, right? The social gap and the environmental gap. But the important message here is how can we achieve convergence? Because in the previous graph, we can see that these curves, they are static, right? But we can move them. And this is how convergence can be found. So when we move the red line, the red equation, which represents the environmental constraints, this here in essence represents technological progress. It represents doing more or producing more economic value in terms of GDP with less, either by consuming less input or by producing less contaminating output. So moving this curve upwards, it would expand the growth rate of the periphery by introducing green technologies, green innovation that would increase the capability of producing or delivering economic growth without putting pressure on the carbon budget. This would also allow for the YS curve to be reduced because by creating productive, technological, innovative capabilities, this means that the economies are also creating more jobs. And this is the main message that we want to deliver. There is a converging effort that needs to be achieved in which those three growth rates can converge to the same level. That is, to a level where we have social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability. So this is, as I insist, a very simple model, but it makes explicit the argument of the centrality of building capabilities in peripheral economies, building innovative and technological capabilities, building productive capabilities that will allow those countries to increase their potential to expand outputs without damaging or hampering the environment, and increasing productive inclusion by means of more intensive job economies. So closing the three gaps requires industrial, environmental, and social policies simultaneously. And this is the coordination that I was referring to when I said that if we could summarize a big push for sustainability in one word, it would be policy coordination. So here you can see again the three gaps, right? The economic growth that is consistent with external equilibrium, external accounts, the YS, which is the minimum target for growth with equality, and the YL, which is the growth that is consistent with the Paris Agreement. So in order for this to occur, there needs to be redistribution policies. So only focusing on economic growth and all the jobs that will be created from economic growth itself is not sufficient. Further redistributional policies are necessary as well. It will also be necessary structural change, developing economic sectors that are more labor intensive and that will be capable of including more workers in the economic sectors. And decarbonization, the broad or massive application of decarbonizing technologies and practices that will allow for job creation and, of course, technical progress as mentioned. So let's move now to more evidence on, we have seen now what the conceptual model looks like. Now let's move on to what the evidence says. On this graph, you can see the patent intensity in exports indicator. So this indicator, the larger it is, this means that the more technologically complex these economies are. They have more patents, which is a proxy for innovation and technological progress. And here you can see the income elasticity ratio, which, as argued before, the more complex the economies are, the higher the income elasticity, right? For the reasons that I mentioned before. So those countries that specialize, such as Asian and emerging Europe, as these economies specialize their exports in goods and services that are more patent intensive, that are more complex, that bear more technological sophistication, this means that their income elasticity ratio is also larger. Remember that when the global economy grows, so the global income grows, it will grow more. The demand for those products in which these countries specialize in will grow more because the income elasticity ratio is bigger than Latin American countries. So the evidence is very clear in that regard, and this speaks to the balance of payment external constraints. The second evidence that I wanted to bring to you is a recent finding that we prepared for this paper, and we made further expansions later on, that shows a negative correlation between economic complexity of economies and greenhouse gas emissions intensity. What this graph is showing is that the more economically complex, economic complexity is an indicator that shows how the capabilities that are available in a given economy, the technological capabilities that are available in a given economy. So the more complex they are, an economy is, the more capabilities, the more technological capabilities that economy presents. So those economies here, we can see Japan, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Great Britain. The economies that are more technologically complex, they also present a lower intensity of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very important finding, and this is true not just for greenhouse gas emissions intensity, which is units of greenhouse gas emissions per GDP unit, but this is also true at the per capita level. And when we look at these same data from a dynamic perspective, so how they change in time, we find also evidence of absolute decoupling from greenhouse gas emissions to GDP when economic complexity increases. This is a very important finding because it tells us two important reflections or hypotheses. One is that reducing greenhouse gas emissions requires capability, requires having the capability of presenting a potential for the economy to grow, for GDP to grow, with less greenhouse gas emissions. So this requires capabilities, scientific, technological, innovative, productive capabilities. So this result is important at this one hand. The second one is that the same capabilities that deliver higher economic complexity also deliver better environmental performance. And this is a very positive message in terms of the convergence of the three gaps, because it tells us that those capabilities that deliver competitiveness and better outlooks for economic growth, for job creation, they also are important capabilities in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there are also good news in terms of the relation between economic complexity and inequality, meaning that those economies that are more complex, they also present a lower Gini index, which means that more economically complex economies are also better distributed in relation to those that present less economic complexity. This is, in essence, ladies and gentlemen, the most important theoretical contribution of ECLAC to Latin American structuralist economic thinking, which refers to the importance of what we call the endogenization of technological progress, or the importance of peripheral countries such as Latin American economies to build their own capacities to produce, improve their Gini index, improve income distribution, and improve environmental performance. Now, before moving to the scenarios, I know that this can sound very abstract at the moment, but to bring this to reality. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have just had COP30 in Belém, here in Brazil. And one of the messages that we ECLAC emphasized in Belém was the importance for Latin American and Caribbean countries to build productive capabilities in order to translate the climate benefits of green investments also into economic and social benefits. because what is happening, what we observe is that most of the countries in the region are indebting themselves in foreign exchange by issuing green bonds or sustainable development bonds. So they are increasing their financial vulnerability in foreign exchange with all the risks that this represents, and using this finance to invest in mostly imported technology, investing in imported electric vehicles, investing in imported solar photovoltaic panels, investing in important wind turbines, etc., and so forth. So what this means is that, and this is in no way a criticism of green investments. On the contrary, we are very much aware and encourage the urgent need to address the climate emergency because, as I mentioned in the beginning, the climate emergency in itself will aggravate development gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean. But the key that will allow these green, decarbonizing, resilient, sustainable investments to materialize in a better economic performance, more jobs created in the territory, for higher income created in Latin American countries is the development of productive capabilities. Many countries in the region have been recognized as a green power. Indeed, there is a large abundance of biomass. This is one of the few areas in which Latin American countries are competitive in the production of biofuels, biodiesel, sustainable aviation fuels. There is an abundance of natural capital when we think also about biodiversity. So translating this vast natural capital into economic opportunities by developing innovative, technological, and productive capabilities is the very key that will allow for the three gaps to be closed simultaneously. So this is the message that I want you to focus on. And before I end my presentation, I would like to present to you a few of the scenarios that we ran in order to test for this hypothesis. Unfortunately, we economists, we do not have a laboratory in which we can test the policies. Our labs are the simulations, the abstract economic models. So at least in the world of simulations, we wanted to see if we can sustain our hypothesis for the convergence of these three developmental gaps in the region. So we have carried out a simple exercise with only a couple of scenarios to illustrate the argument. We have built a reference scenario in which the historic development trajectory is reproduced in Latin American and Caribbean countries. So in the reference scenario, you will see there is a relatively slow economic growth, high income disparities, balance of trade, balance of payments or trade disequilibrium, and an increasing dependence on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. And to compare with this reference scenario that represents the history or the business as usual in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have prepared or built an alternative scenario based on policies for sustainable development that is focused on strategic investments, strategic areas identified as part of the big push for sustainability, that are object of investments and that carry the potential to transform the development model towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. We have used the simulation model that I will not detail at this moment. I don't think that this is the most important topic right now, but to anyone that is interested, I'm happy to share more information. This model with 3ME is very interesting for peripheral economists for a number of reasons, but one of them is that it is a non-equilibrium model, which means that there is no underlying assumption that leads to market clearance, that leads to full employment of the labor force, that leads to zero equilibrium in the external accounts. And for these reasons, it is a model that is capable of reproducing structural, long-standing developmental gaps that peripheral economies such as Latin American economies face. Again, I don't want to go into too much details here, but just to illustrate what are those strategic areas in which we simulated investments in Latin American economies. So we have simulated investments, and this is just to illustrate for those of you that are curious and are willing to navigate the world of economic modeling. We always have to be very specific and justify very clearly what parameters we are using in the model, how they are changed, and why. So these are the areas of investments that we focus. In terms of sustainable energy transition, we have simulated an increase in electricity generation through non-conventional renewable energy sources, such as wind, solar, biomass, and others. We have simulated also investments in sustainable mobility, which refers to the increased use of electric and hybrid vehicles in substitution to internal combustion engine vehicles. And we have also proposed an increase in the use of biofuels in the transport sector, such as ethanol and biodiesel. In the bioeconomy, as mentioned, we have expanded the use of biofuels, and we have also simulated investments in the recovery of natural capital, investments in reforestation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also, the digital transformation, which is a very important sector for the long-term competitiveness of the region. Health manufacturing, bearing in mind the gaps that we identified in the region, especially in the pandemics, in increasing the autonomy of the region in this sector. The circular economy, so better use of materials, recycling, replacement of fossil fuels with energy sources, and of course the care economy, which is a strategic area for more inclusive economy in the region. You can see the strategy and the specific parameters here on the table. As mentioned, I will not be addressing them, but this is just an illustrative scenario that shows that for this example, accelerating investments in those strategic areas that I just mentioned, we, Latin American and the Caribbean region, will observe an increased GDP performance. So the economies will grow at a higher rate under a big push for sustainability scenario in comparison to business as usual. This growth in the GDP is led by investments, by construction, because we have created the scenarios in this way. But also at a smaller extent, it's also led by an increase in consumption and in government spending. This important increase in or improvement in the economic performance of Latin American and Caribbean economies is accompanied by a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And this reduction of 35% by 2030 is higher than the current climate commitments of Latin American and Caribbean countries. So the climate ambition could be increased with an improved or strengthened economic performance. And sulfur dioxide emissions are here also to illustrate an alternative environmental gain from these kinds of investments. Importantly, there would be an increase in imports, but also in exports, but also in imports, which signal the importance of strengthening internal capabilities. But, and with this, I will end the discussion of the results. But importantly, the increase in the jobs in relation to the reference scenario, so there will be more jobs in the big push for sustainability scenario compared to a business as usual scenario. The increase in jobs is slower than in wages, which means that the jobs that are being created are better paid than the ones in the reference scenario. So our results indicate, in coherence with what we propose with the three gap models, that the correct mix of investments and policies in strategic areas for development can simultaneously close the socioeconomic and environmental gaps. Here you can see some more details that I will not discuss at the moment, but the persistence of some developmental challenges, in particular relating to the trade balance and income distribution, they require an acceleration in the process of building capabilities and also in terms of international cooperation. I think I've covered the most important messages here, and just to highlight once again, if I had to select one more important or the most important message from the three gap model, is that there is a path. It is possible for Latin American and Caribbean economies to pursue a development trajectory that simultaneously closes economic, social, and environmental gaps. And the construction of this alternative development style or development model necessarily involves strengthening local productive, technological, and productive capabilities, along with or in coordination with social policies, trade competitiveness policies, etc. I think I've exceeded my time a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to provide you a very non-economist maybe, or try to be least technical as possible. And I'm looking forward to the comments of the discussions in the wider audience.
Thank you very much.